starts with a single note, soft, trembling, almost shy. Then it blooms. A voice so rich, so wounded, so defiant that time itself seems to pause just to listen. That voice belonged to Etta James, the woman who could turn heartbreak into thunder, who could take one word, "at last," and make the whole world believe in love again. But behind that voice was chaos. Behind the sequined gowns and the spotlight was a girl who had to fight for love, for dignity, for control over her own name. Before Aretha Franklin, there was Etta. Before respect, there was that golden, aching cry that came from deep inside a wounded child who never knew her father and barely knew her mother. They called her the Queen of Soul before the crown passed on, but Etta didn't need titles. She was the soul. Raw, flawed, unpolished soul. Born out of pain, raised in the streets of Los Angeles, she sang her way through hunger, loneliness, and violence. Every note she hit was a bruise healing in public. Every stage she stepped on was another chance to prove that the girl nobody wanted could still make the world stop and listen. Etta once said, "The blues are the songs of despair, but when you sing them, you take despair and turn it into joy." And maybe that's why she survived longer than anyone expected, because she turned her own despair into fire. From church pews to prison cells, from heroin to Hollywood, her story wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about falling again and again and singing anyway. And when the world thought she was finished, she'd come back, standing under those bright lights. Her voice rougher, older, deeper but still able to melt steel. Because her voice wasn't trained, it was lived. This is not just the story of a singer. It's the story of a woman who broke every rule, lost everything, and still found herself in the music. This is Etta James, the fire behind the voice. Etta James was born without a father and almost without a name. On the 25th of January 1938, in the rough corners of Los Angeles, a teenage girl named Dorothy Hawkins gave birth to a baby she could not raise. Dorothy was only 14, still a child herself, trying to survive in a world that didn't forgive poor, black, unwed girls. They said the baby was light-skinned, her hair soft and golden brown. Some whispered that her father was a white pool player, the legendary Minnesota Fats. But Etta would spend a lifetime chasing that rumor, never getting an answer. What she did get, however, was a wound that never closed. Her mother, Dorothy, drifted through the city hustling, running, disappearing for weeks at a time. So the baby was left with Lula and Jesse Rogers, landlords who took her in as foster parents. They gave her a home, a new name, James Etta Hawkins, a blend of James and Cosetta. And for a moment, it seemed like the world might finally be kind. But kindness didn't last long. At the age of 5, she began singing in a church choir, the voice of a child, but with the pain of someone much older. The congregation would stop and listen. Her voice was both haunting and holy. Her choir director, Professor Hines, was known for his harsh training. He would hit her in the chest as she sang, trying to make her project from her gut. Etta later said, "That's how I learned to sing like a grown woman from pain." And Hollywood stars and musicians began to visit that church, drawn by the miracle child with the thunder in her lungs. They said little James Etta could make heaven weep. But behind the spotlight, darkness was growing. Her foster father started to exploit her talent, waking her in the middle of the night to sing for his friends, punishing her if she refused. It was her first taste of the cruelty that so often hides behind applause. Then tragedy struck again. Her foster mother, Lula, the only woman who had ever truly loved her, died suddenly of a stroke. At just 12 years old, Etta was sent back to her birth mother, the same mother who was still hustling, still broken, still running from her own demons. That reunion was not love. It was chaos. Dorothy and Etta fought constantly. Dorothy would disappear for days, leaving her child to fend for herself in the dangerous streets of San Francisco's Fillmore district. Etta stopped going to school. She started running with street gangs, smoking, drinking, doing whatever it took to belong somewhere, anywhere. But even in rebellion, her voice never left her. She sang on street corners, in tiny clubs, at house parties, her teenage soul bleeding through every note. Music became her refuge. her rebellion, her revenge. By the time she was 14, the little girl from the church choir had become a survivor, fierce, wounded, unstoppable. And soon, a chance meeting with a bandleader named Johnny Otis would change her life forever. Because in a world that had used her voice and broken her trust, she was about to learn how to use that voice for herself. At 14, Etta James wasn't supposed to be famous. She was supposed to be another forgotten girl in the streets of San Francisco, a runaway, a troublemaker, a name no one would remember. But fate had a strange way of finding her. One night, while performing with a small neighborhood trio called the Creolettes, Etta caught the attention of a man who would change her life, Johnny Otis, one of the most respected bandleaders in rhythm and blues. He saw something in that defiant teenage girl, a fire that couldn't be taught, a voice that sounded like it had already lived 100 lifetimes. Johnny took her under his wing, renamed the group the Peaches, and gave Jamesetta a new identity, Etta James. The name rolled off the tongue like destiny. Her first record, Roll With Me, Henry, a playful answer to Hank Ballard's hit Work With Me, Annie, was raw, risky, and scandalous for the time. Radio stations refused to play it, calling it too suggestive. But that didn't stop people from listening. The record exploded in the underground black clubs. The streets were singing her name. Soon, Roll With Me, Henry renamed The Wallflower to make it radio-safe hit #1 on the R&B charts. Etta was suddenly the voice of young America, fierce, funny, and fearless. But the world didn't pay her fairly for her power. When a white pop singer, Georgia Gibbs, released a watered-down version called Dance With Me, Henry, it sold millions. Etta made nothing. Still, she didn't stop. She dyed her hair platinum blonde, reinvented her image, and started performing across the South with Johnny Guitar Watson. The road was brutal. The racism was constant. One night, after Etta accidentally used the white-only restroom, the gas station owner pulled a gun on Johnny Watson and demanded she apologize. Etta stood her ground. She never said sorry. That was who she was, brave to the edge of reckless. Even as a teenager, she walked through a world built to silence her and refused to shut up. As her reputation grew, so did her circle. She met the rising stars of her generation, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, Ray Charles, and she fell in love with the blues, the raw heartbeat of every broken soul she'd ever known. Her idols were Billie Holiday and Dinah Washington, women who sang from their scars. And though Billie warned her, "Don't end up like me," Etta was already walking the same dangerous road. By the late 1952, her voice had traveled farther than she ever dreamed. It carried her to Chicago, into the doors of Chess Records, where Muddy Waters and Little Walter were rewriting American music. There, she met Leonard Chess, the man who would make her a star, and also make her pay the price for it. Etta James had finally arrived, but fame, for her, was never freedom. It was just a brighter cage, and inside, the little girl with the golden voice was still learning how to survive. By the time Etta James signed with Chess Records, she was barely 20, but her voice already carried the weight of a lifetime. Leonard Chess saw in her what no one else had, not just a singer, but a force. He put her in front of orchestras, surrounded her with horns and strings, told her, "You're not just rhythm and blues, you're elegance, you're gold." And just like that, the girl from Watts became America's most powerful female voice. Her hit, All I Could Do Was Cry, climbed the charts, a song that bled with heartbreak, because it was real. Her lover, the musician Harvey Fuqua, had left her for Gwen Gordy, sister of Motown founder Berry Gordy. When Etta sang, "I Saw Him at the Altar," she wasn't acting. She was reliving it. Then came At Last. When her voice floated through that first verse, time seemed to stop. The song wasn't just about love, it was about survival, about finally being seen after a lifetime of being invisible. It was her masterpiece, her redemption, and the song that would follow her to her grave. But fame didn't heal her. It broke her in new ways. She was rich in applause, but poor in peace. Her royalty checks came with hidden debts. When Chess handed her an envelope marked royalties, She opened it and found a note saying she owed the label $14,000. She laughed and cried because what else could she do? So she drowned the pain the only way she knew how. First with liquor, then with heroin. She said the first time she used, she thought it was cocaine. Then she felt her body melt and the world disappear. She called it a slow dance with the devil. Her life began to unravel. She showed up late to shows, stumbled through rehearsals, pawned her jewelry and instruments to feed her habit. Her manager became her dealer. She loved men who hit her, cheated her, and broke her because pain was the only language she truly spoke. There were brief moments of light. Her friendship with Sam Cooke, who treated her like family. Her bond with Aretha Franklin, who understood her chaos. But tragedy followed her everywhere. When Sam Cooke was murdered in 1964, Etta said she saw his face crushed, his body mangled, and she knew something darker than the headlines had happened. She cried for weeks. The drugs took over completely. She injected in her arms, her feet, even her neck. She overdosed more than once. She was arrested for forging checks and sent to jail. At one point, she nearly died from lockjaw, the result of dirty needles. The doctors called it a miracle that she survived. Her body was breaking, but her voice somehow remained. Every time she came out of rehab, she tried to sing again. And every time she fell, she sang harder. Etta once said, "When you sing the blues, you don't have to explain your pain. The music does it for you." But by the late 1960 seconds, the blues world was fading. Motown had taken over, and Etta James, the queen of soul before Aretha, was fading into the shadows. The applause was quieter now, the crowd smaller, and the woman who once lit up stages with fire was now burning alone in the dark. By the early 1970 seconds, Etta James had hit rock-bottom jail time, overdoses, and the kind of loneliness that no applause could fix. Her body was bruised, her voice raspy, and her spirit barely holding on. But sometimes, it's in the wreckage that we find the rawest kind of grace. When she walked out of rehab thin, tired, shaking, she didn't want fame. She just wanted to live. Music was no longer a career. It was oxygen. She began performing again, not in grand halls, but in small, smoky clubs. People came not just to hear her sing, but to witness her survival. They saw the scars on her arms, the limp in her walk, and yet, when she opened her mouth, it was as if God himself was speaking through her pain. Then came Tell Mama, a record born out of exhaustion and truth. Recorded in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, the song was raw, gospel-drenched, unapologetically female. It hit the charts hard. But the real masterpiece on that album was I'd Rather Go Blind. That song was Etta in her purest form, heartbreak, without the filter, beauty wrapped in surrender. When Leonard Chess first heard it, he cried. Etta hated performing it. She said it hurt too much, but it became her anthem. Because she was that song. Even as the decades changed and her fame dimmed, her artistry only deepened. She sang for those who'd been forgotten, those who'd lost themselves, and still found the strength to keep breathing. She toured again, this time sober, standing tall beside legends like B.B. King and Al Green. And her audience had changed, no longer just Black America, but the whole world. In smoky blues bars, in Paris jazz halls, in sold-out European tours, they worshipped the woman who turned suffering into sound. By the 1980 seconds, she was finally getting her due. Her voice had matured heavier, deeper, like aged whiskey. She won her first Grammy for Mystery Lady, Songs of Billie Holiday, a tribute to her idol and, in many ways, a reflection of herself. It took 40 years, but the world had finally caught up to Etta James. She used to say, "You can't fake soul. Either you lived it or you didn't." And she had lived every inch of it, the joy, the heartbreak, the sin, and the salvation. By the 2000s, honors poured in Grammys, Hall of Fame inductions, a star on Hollywood Boulevard. Younger artists, Beyoncé, Adele, Amy Winehouse, all pointed to her as the reason they sang. Her music had become immortal, stitched into the DNA of American soul. Even as her health began to fade, Etta kept performing. often in a chair, her voice trembling but fierce. When Beyoncé portrayed her in Cadillac Records, Etta watched quietly, proud yet distant. She said later, "That girl did me justice." Her story was no longer tragedy. It was testimony, proof that even broken women could rise, that survival itself was a kind of art. Etta James didn't just come back, she transcended. From the dirt of Watts to the stars of Hollywood, she had turned her pain into a hymn the whole world could hum. And when the final curtain began to close, her voice, that wild, beautiful, defiant voice, still carried the same truth it always had. You can take the girl out of the blues, but you can never take the blues out of the girl. In the end, it wasn't the stage lights that faded first, it was her body. By the late 2000s, Etta James had outlived most of her peers, the ones who burned too bright, too fast, and left nothing but echoes. Her voice, once volcanic and unstoppable, had softened into something fragile, trembling like the last candle flickering after a long night. She battled everything that tried to take her down: heroin, heartbreak, prison, pain. And when those enemies lost, new ones appeared. Leukemia, dementia, the quiet theft of memory. There were days when she could no longer remember the lyrics to At Last, the song that had once carried her through every storm. But even then, when her son played those first few piano notes, something deep inside her eyes would light up, faint but unmistakable. Her husband, Artis Mills, stayed by her side for over 4 decades. He'd seen her at her worst, trembling in alleyways, sleeping in jail cells, fighting her demons on and off the mic, and yet he never left. In her final years, he fought the courts to keep her home, to care for her himself. Not for the legend, but for the woman. And the world, the same world that once ignored her, now stood still to honor her. Rolling Stone called her one of the greatest voices ever recorded. The Grammy Foundation named her a lifetime icon. Beyoncé sang her song at the president's inauguration. And every young woman with a microphone, from Adele to Jennifer Hudson, carried a piece of Etta's fire in her chest. On the 20th of January 2012, 5 days before her 74th birthday, the Queen of Soul, before there was a Queen of Soul, took her final breath in a riverside hospital, surrounded by the hum of machines and the whisper of her own music, playing softly in the background. Outside, fans left flowers, letters, and vinyl records on her star at Hollywood Boulevard. No fireworks, no grand farewell, just silence and the echo of that impossible voice. But maybe that's how she would have wanted it. Etta James never asked for pity. She never wanted to be remembered as a victim. She wanted to be remembered as real, as the girl who fought, fell, and sang her way back every single time. Her life wasn't a tragedy, it was a testimony. She showed the world that women who break can still be whole, that even when the world forgets your name, your voice can make them remember. Some stories don't need closure. Some stories end with a song that never really stops playing. And if you listen closely, maybe late at night, maybe when you need it most, you can still hear her somewhere between heaven and the radio, that smoky, defiant voice whispering one last truth. At last, my love has come along. If this story touched you, take a moment tonight to play At Last, not as a love song, but as a prayer for every woman who ever had to fight for her own worth. Because Etta didn't just sing for herself, she sang for all of us.